What's going on, everyone? It's Adrian from Draft Time, and we're back with another picks video. Now, in this video, I'm going to go over the main FanDuel slate for tonight, which is a 6 game slate. It doesn't include the later games, which is nice. But let's go ahead and get right into it. Now, normally with these videos, I go through each player and I go through each game. But this video, I'm gonna keep it a lot shorter. I'm pressed for time, so I'm gonna keep this video short and sweet. But anyways, let's take a look at some of the key injuries for tonight. And you got Luca and Kyrie. They're both questionable. Now, I expect both of them to play, but obviously, if either of them end up missing the game, then that's going to add a lot more value to a lot more of those Mavericks players. Then you got Rozier. He just got traded to Miami, so he's questionable. I think even if he does end up playing, he's not going to play a lot of minutes because he still needs to learn that Miami Heat system. Then you got Jalen Green for Houston. He's questionable. You want to pay attention to that. Mike Conley is questionable for the Timberwolves, and they're going against the Wizards. So if he ends up missing the game, whoever his backup ends up being is going to be incredibly valuable. And then Nick Richards and Cody Martin for Charlotte, they're questionable, and they're already without Rozier, who they just traded. So if either of them end up missing the game, that's going to add a lot of value to a lot of those Charlotte players. But yeah, those are some of the key questionable guys. Now let's take a look at some of the key guys who are out tonight. So most of these guys have been out for a while now, with the exception of Santi Aldama. He just got injured last game, so that does add a little bit more value for some guys on Memphis, specifically someone like John Conchar. But yeah, that's those are the key guys who are out tonight. Now, as far as my top value plays, the top value play of the slate, that's going to be Shangun at $9,400. Now, he's on a nice stretch right now. He's averaging 50.4 over his last 5 games. And the matchup he's got tonight against Portland, that's a great matchup for him. Portland actually allows the fourth most fantasy points to opposing centers. And really, all of these top value guys for tonight, they're all pretty much based off of matchup. They all have really good matchups tonight, and I'll go through them. Anthony Edwards going against Washington. Washington is awful defensively, and they allow the most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards out of any team in the league. Then you got Duran going against the Hornets, and the Hornets allow the second most points to opposing centers. Gobert against Washington. Washington allows the most points against opposing centers. You got Nurkic. He's only $6,900 because he's coming off of back-to-back pretty bad games. But when you look at those specific games, on the 21st against Indiana, he fouled out that game, and then the matchup after that was against Chicago, who's a really good team defensively. So $6,900 is a really good price for Nurkic, and he's going against Dallas, who allow the eighth most fantasy points to opposing centers. So there's a lot of valuable centers tonight. So even though I really like Shangun, I'm going to mix in some of these other guys. And another guy I like is Bam Adebayo at $8,900. We'll talk about him later on. Now, let me go ahead and show you my top sleeper play for the night. That's going to be from Milwaukee, Malik Beasley at $4,700. Now, we only have him projected for 20 fantasy points, and that's mainly because of his matchup against Cleveland. Cleveland is a really good team defensively, but if he ends up closing out the fourth quarter and hitting a bunch of shots, he could easily exceed that 20-point projection. And there's not a whole lot of guys in the 4,000s tonight that could, score 25 plus. Malik Beasley is one of them. The only other one I could think of tonight is John Conchar for the Grizzlies with no Aldama tonight. So let's go ahead and run the top lineup just to see what it spits out. So you got Nick Smith. He's going to be getting a lot of minutes with no Rozier. Whether or not he gets the start is to be seen. But at $3,800, that's extremely cheap. Now, he's only projected for 17 fantasy points. And even if he does get the start, his projection is not going to go up that much more because he's really, really inefficient from a fantasy perspective. He averages just 0.69 fantasy points per minute. So even with the minutes increase, his projection is still not going to be that high. So I'm not crazy about him, but you still have to pick him up at $3,800 because that's just so cheap. Then you got Bradley Beal, Anthony Edwards, Luke Kennard, John Conchar, Caleb Martin, Carlo Anthony Towns, Jabari Smith, and then Shangun. Now, I want to take a look at Minnesota. They got that really good matchup against Washington. Now, you got Anthony Edwards and Carl Anthony Towns. They both get picked up by the optimizer, but they're actually negatively correlated. And I got the stats for you right here. When Anthony Edwards has an above average game, Cat averages just 37 fantasy points per game. And when Anthony Edwards has a below average game, Cat actually averages 45.2 fantasy points per game. So there's an extreme negative correlation between these two. So I'm going to consider fading one of each in a few lineups. Now, Rudy Gobert, on the other hand, and Anthony Edwards, their correlation is pretty negligible. So maybe you consider fading Cat for Gobert, um, especially with Gobert having a great matchup against the Wizards, who allow the most fantasy points to opposing centers. Now, with the Mike Conley injury, um, you want to see who ends up starting for them. It's either going to be McLaughlin or Shake Milton. I really like whoever ends up being the starter. And even if one's going to be the starter and the other is coming off the bench, maybe you fade the starter for the guy coming off the bench just in case the starter ends up having a really bad game. That's an angle I take a lot when you have a situation like this. Now, if Mike Conley does end up playing, even he's got value against this Washington defense who's awful. So, yeah, I'm going to cap it off at no more than two players from this game, unless, of course, Mike Conley ends up missing the game. Then maybe I'll consider three players from the Timberwolves. Now, let's take a look at the centers for the slate. And like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of value at that center spot. One angle I really like is Faden Şengün for Bam Adebayo. Şengün is $500 more, and Bam could easily outscore Şengün. And if you look at it, actually, Bam and Şengün basically average the same amount of points on the season. Bam actually has a slight edge, 43.79 fantasy points per game, and Şengün, 43.74 fantasy points per game. So Bam has a slight edge there. And Memphis actually allows the sixth most fantasy points to opposing centers. So that's a pretty good angle there. You could also fade Şengün for Gobert, who's going against Washington, like I mentioned earlier. You could fade him for Jalen Duren, who's going against Charlotte, and Charlotte's pretty bad defensively against centers. So, yeah, those are the centers that I really like for tonight. Now let's take a look at that Memphis game because you got two Memphis players. You got Kennard and Conchar. Um, I might fade Kennard in a few lineups at $5,700. I don't think he has that high of a ceiling. I mean, he's been pretty consistent, but his best game was last game, 30 points. All those other games, he's been in the 20s. So I don't think he has that high of a ceiling for GPP. You got Conchar at $4,800. He's going to end up in a ton of lineups. Maybe you consider fading him for David Roddy, just in case they end up going with Roddy at the end of the game, who's $300 cheaper. And he's been getting pretty decent minutes recently. So that might be an angle you want to consider. Otherwise, I'm going to have a lot of Conchar. Let's take a look at Dallas because you got those question marks on Luka and Kyrie. I think they're both going to play, but if one of them misses, then obviously the other becomes a lot more valuable. So if Kyrie misses, maybe pick up some Luka. If Luka misses, maybe pick up some Kyrie. If either of them miss, then maybe pick up some Tim Hardaway Jr. $6,400 isn't exactly cheap for him, but if either of these guys miss the game, he'll probably shoot up to the low 30s. And at shooting guard and small forward, there's not a lot of guys in the 6,000s tonight with that kind of value. So I would consider some Tim Hardaway if either of them miss the game. But like I said, I think they're both going to end up playing tonight. But let's go ahead and take a look at Charlotte. Now, with no Rozier, I like LaMelo Ball a lot, so I'm going to lock him into a few lineups. Um, Brandon Miller at 6,700, he's on a nice stretch right now, so I might lock him into a few lineups, especially with no Rozier, who they just traded. And if Cody Martin ends up missing the game, I think that adds a lot more value to Brandon Miller. If Nick Richards misses the game, then PJ Washington, he becomes playable, but I'm still not crazy about him at $6,200. I mean, last game he only dropped 30 without Nick Richards, and that was his best game in a while. So I just don't think that's going to cut it in GPP. Now, Nick Smith is someone I talked about earlier, going to get a lot more minutes, but still not that very efficient. So yeah, that's Charlotte. Now for Phoenix, the optimizer ends up picking up Bradley Beal. Maybe you consider fading him for KD because KD's on a nice little stretch right now. He's had a 70 and a 60-point game in his last two games. And this is a pretty decent matchup going against Dallas. This game actually has the highest over-under of the night. Maybe you could fade both of those guys for Devin Booker. Nurkic is a guy who's a lot more valuable tonight, so maybe you fade Şengün for some of Nurkic. But other than that, I don't really like any of these other guys from Phoenix. One more thing for Detroit, you got Cade Cunningham looking to make his return tonight at $8,300. He's worth consideration in a few lineups just because he was on a really good stretch before he got injured. but I'm not going to go too crazy with him because he might be on a minutes restriction. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all my feedback for tonight. Some different angles and some different value players you want to look at. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and good luck to everyone tonight.